Hello and welcome to the first episode of the RWR Solo show. I'm Ben Spindler and thanks for joining me. Now I want to start by quickly explaining what this is and what it isn't because I don't want there to be any confusion. As some of you will know, myself, Old Man and Tom, we have a weekly podcast called the Random Wrestling Review, which we are going to continue and will continue to be the main focus of this channel and our social media channels that we've got out there at RWR Pod UK on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. It'll also be the main focus of our YouTube channel as well. But we recently did an episode which focused on this year's Royal Rumble, and we put it out there about a week after the show had happened. But given the commitments we've all got in our own home lives and our family lives, it was decided that actually that was a little bit of a stretch for us to do. We like having the flexibility of when we record and when we edit, and we didn't really want to have the pressure of the quick turnaround times, and especially to get us all in the same place at the same time during a specific week was actually quite complicated. And so we decided that for that podcast, we are unlikely to cover shows that take place in real time. So when it comes to, for example, WrestleMania 37 that's coming up in April, it's unlikely that the Random Wrestling Review will cover that because it's just logistically not a great thing for us to do. But I still had a desire to kind of review shows that I'm watching as and when they come up. And I think the podcast, the weekly podcast itself, has really kind of refired my interest in pro wrestling. It's great to be able to look back at those shows and pick out the stuff I like and pick out the stuff that I don't like so much. And what was also great was that when we watched the Rumble 2021, it kind of got me back into watching wrestling of now, and not just WWE, but also watching some of the other big promotions in North America as well. And so I thought it'd be great to have an outlet for me to talk about those shows and not have to gather everyone together and do a big recording and do a big editing session. I can just watch the shows as and when I want them. I can record the episode as and when I want to, and hopefully there will be minimal editing required because I'm not going to go off on quite so many tangents as we tend to do on the Random Wrestling Review. So as I say, that show will continue. This is entirely separate, and that's why this doesn't appear on our usual podcast feed, because I didn't want there to be any confusion about what this was. It is a different show. If you've listened to that show, you'll find that, I'm kind of the more analytical of the three of us. I'm the one who kind of likes to analyze wrestling down to the nth degree, and they are much more into kind of the fun and the humor and that kind of stuff that they can get out of it. And so that will be a very different show. This is going to be very different. Now, if you are into that kind of humorous side of things, then this show probably won't be for you. And so I just didn't want to mix it up with our usual feed and turn people off of that show. So basically the message is if all you want to do is listen to our podcast, which comes out once a week and talks about past shows that have been taking place many years ago, then that will absolutely continue and that won't change. What this is going to be is, as I say, is a much more analytical show. It's just myself on my own, talking about recent shows that I've watched and reviewing them and doing the same things, talking about them in the same ways as I would do any other show, but just doing it alone. So there's a couple of upshots to that. First one is, as I say, there'll be a lot less humor and a lot more kind of the analytical side of the shows, but also these are likely to be much shorter. And that's one of the reasons why they're on YouTube, is that I wanted a place to put them that wasn't in the same place as the other podcasts, but I also wanted it to be attached to the Random Wrestling Review as a kind of side project to that. And we don't get a lot of views on YouTube. Let's be honest about it. We're not kind of going to make any money from the show at all anytime soon. And I just thought this would be an interesting way for me to grow that channel, grow that kind of bit of the Random Wrestling Review a little bit, was just to put up these kind of ad hoc shows and kind of reach an audience of people that's perhaps a little bit different and also wants perhaps a little bit of different content. Perhaps there is an audience out there that doesn't appreciate some of the more humorous aspects of our weekly show, and so that's less likely to be involved in this. And also, we're never going to cover a lot of the shows. There was no chance we would cover a lot of the shows that I am going to be looking at here because, frankly, Tom and Old Man wouldn't have been interested in watching them. And then in other cases, it just would have been a case of us organising ourselves, as I said earlier on, and that just wasn't really practical. So today I'm going to be looking at one of the pay-per-views that took place over the weekend. Now I know that there was a big NXT TakeOver show at the weekend, and I do intend to watch that and review that as well on this same channel. But one of the show I did actually watch, and I have already watched, is Impact's No Surrender 2021 pay-per-view. So you can kind of get a feel for kind of how niche this is likely to be in comparison to that kind of weekly podcast. This is the kind of show that very few people, if we're really honest, doesn't have a huge reach. Very few people would have actually watched it in comparison to the number of wrestling fans that are out there. So I'm going to be appealing to a much smaller audience here. And as I say, we already don't do great numbers on YouTube anyway. So this is just a tester to see if it does anything. And I'm not expecting any major numbers or anything. I'm not expecting lots and lots of people to listen to this. It's just something I wanted to do. I like to be able to, after having watched a wrestling show, I like to be able to digest it and think about it and decide how I feel about that show. And very often that leaves me just thinking in my own head about some of these thoughts and them never going anywhere. So I figured, well, I may as well just put them down onto an audio track and release them out there. And then anybody else who wants to listen to them can do as well. So yeah, I was drawn to Impact's No Surrender pay-per-view because I basically turned on the television maybe 2-3 weeks ago and saw that Impact Wrestling was there, and I thought I'll have a look at that because I haven't watched Impact Wrestling, or I hadn't watched Impact Wrestling for a good 5 years prior to the last couple of weeks. And I watched it and I wasn't overly impressed with the weekly television show, I've got to be honest. I felt like it lacked a little bit of context for new viewers. Probably appealed to people who were kind of frequent viewers of the show. They probably completely were able to follow what was going on. They knew who everyone would. They obviously were going to know who everyone was, which I didn't. And there were any number of storylines that were in flight at that point as they are building up to this show that I struggled perhaps to get a kind of grip on what was going on with them. But I resolved to continue to watch it, and specifically I decided I'm going to watch No Surrender because I figured it would be a great way to get myself back into the product, to see the wrestlers and the wrestling and the matches at the sort of main point in time rather than on the weekly television show. This was an important show for the company because it is obviously one of their bigger shows. And so I just thought it was a great stepping off point for me to try and get back into Impact. And as I said, I watched a couple of episodes of the weekly show prior to this. And what struck me about going into this show was the fact that there were quite a few matches set up on the show. So I think in total I've got quite a lot of notes here, but I think there's about 7 or 8 matches, possibly as many as 9 matches on this show. And every single one of them, what I was impressed with is that every single one of them had a reason to happen. There had been some storyline build to every single match of this one. Now, obviously some had less than others. They weren't all on an equal footing in terms of the amount of build-up that had gone into them. But every single match had been given a little bit of a build-up within those weekly shows. So that kind of made me think twice about what I was talking about earlier on about the lack of context that I thought was in those episodes of Impact. Like this show, this pay-per-view had a lot of context. There was lots of reasons for the wrestlers to fight. There was only one occasion I think in the entire show where there hadn't been a pre-match story built up for the match to take place, and that is really refreshing because there's nothing that I dislike more than pro wrestling when there's no context, when they've just thrown 2 people out there or more than 2 people out there, and they've just expected you to invest yourself in the match simply because it is a wrestling match. For me, that isn't what wrestling is about for me personally. So Impact No Surrender, how should I do this? I think what I'll do is I will go through it kind of match by match, segment by segment, and try and give my opinion. I think what I'll do though, much like we do on the Random Wrestling Review, I'll give an early kind of indication as to how I felt overall about the show. Now I've got to be honest, when I first started watching this, after the first sort of 3 matches or so, I was a little bit concerned because even though, as I said, there was storyline going into all 3 of them, there was just a feeling of not a lot of variation between the matches. They all felt very samey. The styles of matches that they were felt similar. The lengths of the matches were all the same. And I think sometimes in wrestling fans' minds there is a sense that you want every match to be given the chance to breathe and be a really good match. But I think in the case of what happens in practice is actually it's really good if some matches are short and don't have the time to breathe, because it means that when the matches that you want to really mean something come along, you can make them mean a whole lot more. They can feel much better. And the first 3 matches, I thought they were all given sort of 7, 8, 9 minutes time to take place. They were all pretty decent. They were all perfectly functional matches. There were very few mistakes. There was no botches. It was very tidy action, but it was just a little bit unremarkable, quite frankly. And I was worried that was going to be how the whole show played out. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And as we got to sort of match 4, which was the triple threat revolver match for the number 1 contendership to the X Division title, after that point, everything changed. That match and everything beyond that point was just added much more variety to it. The matches were different. There was different feels about them all, and they had they just seemed like there'd been a bit more kind of imagination had gone into them, as opposed to just chucking out a couple of people and expecting them to have some kind of a match. The show itself started with a kind of emotional video package featuring Tommy Dreamer, who was obviously about to embark upon a chance at the Impact World Championship, given to him by Rich Swann to mark Dreamer's 50th birthday. Look, I think we'll get to the match and the quality of the match later on, but in terms of a reason for somebody to be given a World Championship match, this is about the flimsiest as I've seen. And it was actually one of the things that first struck me when I first watched Impact Wrestling recently, was that the thing that you're building up to, the pay-per-view that you're building up to in the next couple of weeks, the main event features a guy who's only getting a World Championship shot because he's turning 50. And Tommy Dreamer, I don't want to disrespect Tommy Dreamer or anything. He's been a decent wrestler during his career, and he's had a significant role to play in a number of different promotions. But he is not the kind of... he was never really a pay-per-view headliner, even really in ECW, and certainly not when he got to WWE. And... they kind of try to equate Dreamer's chances winning the World Championship to when Terry Funk won the World Championship in ECW in 1997. The difference being, of course, that Terry Funk was a legitimate draw in his day. So when Terry Funk was at his peak, he could draw thousands of people to an arena to watch him in a main event match with somebody else. Dreamer's never really been that kind of guy. Now, don't get me wrong, he could draw, 100 or so, a couple of hundred fans potentially to an independent wrestling show that came to a much more regionalised promotion in a small town or city. But he's not the kind of guy who's going to get thousands in the door, and never had been during his career that Terry Funk had been. And I think there's a distinction that needs to be made there. So I think Impact Wrestling did their best to try and make this mean something and make it kind of give it that kind of mirror almost to the Terry Funk situation that had taken place in ECW in 97, but it just didn't really wash. And I think in many respects, Tommy Dreamer receiving a World Championship match in the main event of a pay-per-view is quite a damning indictment of where Impact Wrestling are in terms of their talent situation. Now, don't get me wrong, it is difficult. And throughout the show, I was seeing lots of talented wrestlers, lots of people with real ability, both on the men and the women's side of the roster. But the problem Impact have got is because they've got a very small audience. That the weekly figures are in the hundred, about 150,000 rather than the hundreds of thousand. I think the on average there's about 8 times the audience for an AEW show, for example, than there is Impact. Then you compare that to WWE, and it's tens of times bigger. And so when Impact Wrestling, even if they build a new star within their own show, even if they build a new character within their own show that the fans of Impact are really into, that's not going to mean much. That's not going to be covered by anybody else. And so it's much harder for them to build up momentum behind a guy that they have built, or a woman that they have built, into a main event star. And I think this is why they go back to guys like Tommy Dreamer. And I think on the first episode, I saw Ken Shamrock at a match. I mean, these guys are so far beyond their best that it almost feels laughable that they are in important spots in a nationally televised wrestling promotion. But they are. And it's, I think, just the situation Impact finds themselves in terms of what talent is actually available for them to use. So for me, the premise of Tommy Dreamer being a world championship contender and the man who's going to be in this main event was a little bit difficult to accept. The show began with, in terms of matches anyway, began with Tennille Dashwood and Triple XL against Decay. And Decay had only just recently added Black Taurus to their ranks. This was a decent little match. I gave it a 6 out of 10. There was some nice stuff. I thought Black Taurus looked very, very impressive indeed, and he would appear to be a really positive addition to the Impact roster, I would suggest, just on the basis of what I saw during this match. I thought that Matt Striker was a little bit off in terms of what was going on during this match. He seemed to lose his way, and that kind of cost the match a little bit in terms of the presentation. As you're watching, you kind of need the announcers to stay on top of the action so that you can, especially if you're a new audience member, and I think it's something that gets lost sometimes, is that, it's not just people who've been watching Impact week in, week out that will be watching their show each time. There will be some new people, and in order for them to become invested in the show and what they're doing, you need to kind of explain things. And I just didn't think Matt Striker did a particularly good job during this one. In the end, this was won by Decay when Black Taurus hit Larry D with a driver for a pinfall. As I said, it's not too much to talk about. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, where the first 3 matches for me were so-so. They weren't too bad, but they just were completely unremarkable. Not a lot happened. There had been some build up to this. I know that Tennille Dashwood had a match on Impact recently with Rosemary, and she had kind of recruited Triple XL to face Decay alongside her, and that's when Decay had brought in Black Taurus. But in terms of the match itself, it wasn't remarkable. But I will say, I guess in this respect, when I look back at it at the end of the show, that they did get over the sense that Black Taurus was going to be quite a significant member of the roster, and he looked like the star of this match. So in that respect, it did at least achieve that. The second match of the night was Brian Myers and Hernandez against Eddie Edwards and Matt Cardona. This had a video package before it to show all the things that had sort of built up to this match. They mainly concentrated on the feud between Brian Myers and Eddie Edwards that had kind of come about over the previous few weeks. But obviously, I think for any casual observer of this match, or anybody who hasn't really watched Impact Wrestling before, the more significant part was that obviously Brian Myers is the former Kurt Hawkins and Matt Cardona is the former Zack Ryder, and they of course were a tag team back a long time ago now in WWE. They were on separate sides of this match, and that was kind of built in as part of it. Which made for quite an awkward moment near the beginning of the match, where Matt Striker on commentary was trying to accentuate the history of Myers and Cardona in terms of them wrestling alongside one another without saying WWE. He didn't really want to mention the fact that they had been a tag team in WWE, but he was really trying to sell the significance of their history. And really, again, actually, I thought this was, again, a very tidy match. There was plenty of perfectly good wrestling. It would have fit anywhere in terms of its quality, anywhere in wrestling. But there just wasn't much to get excited about. Brian Myers and Hernandez ended up winning after Myers pinned Cardona when he'd dropped him on an exposed turnbuckle. So effectively, earlier in the match, Brian Myers had exposed one of the turnbuckle pads got rid of one of the turnbuckle pads, exposing the metal underneath. And then Cardona had been dropped onto that turnbuckle, and Myers pinned him. They seem to be pushing Myers quite a lot here. They felt like he was supposed to be the main man in this match, which is a surprise when you consider the tenure that Eddie Edwards has had in Impact, and he's obviously held the Impact World Championship in the past, and he's been around for a long period of time. But Brian Myers seems to be the guy that they're trying to make something out of during this match. But again, as I say, there was just a sense where, I don't know, that it just didn't feel like anything really massively exciting or remarkable had taken place. And that feeling continued into match 3, which was Dina against Jake something. This is one of the storylines which I think most stuck out to me on Impact Wrestling, and I was a little bit surprised in the end that this was kind of pushed out there quite early on the show, wasn't made too much of a big deal of. Dina, of course, was accompanied by his Violent by Design stablemates, Eric Young and Joe Doring. I think they look like the kind of thing that Eric Young has been doing now for a good 5 or 6 years. This seems to be Eric Young's thing now, is that he's a cult leader, plays the role really well, but we've seen it. We've seen it in Impact Wrestling before. We have seen it in NXT not too long ago. You can only do it so many times before it starts to feel old, and it is feeling old to me. Nevertheless, I thought that the build-up was quite good. It seemed as well like they were quite eager to try and make something out of Cousin Jake. Why they thought that it would be acceptable to call him Jake something. And they, in fairness, I will give Matt Stryker and D'Lo Brown, who are on commentary, their due during this one. They did do their best to explain why Jake something was called Jake something and why that was considered an appropriate name for someone. He had previously been Cousin Jake, but because of this sort of, he'd been offered a place in Violent by Design, and he decided that if he didn't stand up for something, then he would effectively be nothing. And so he's called Jake something. I think it's a bit convoluted and a bit silly. I just think they could have just kept him either as Cousin Jake or given him the name Jake Dina, I suppose, given that he was supposed to be Dina's cousin. But they've gone with Jake something, and it doesn't really work for me. In the end, Jake something won with a black hole slam when he pinned Dina. It was perfectly fine. It was perfectly serviceable. I think that Jake something looked quite good. This is the first I've pretty much seen him in a wrestling match, and I thought he looked pretty decent. But again, it just felt like it passed. It happened, it passed, and nothing really came of it. Nothing really exciting took place. And I just think that the order here was a bit messed up. Maybe if these first 3 matches had been slotted in between the other matches on the show, these 3 might not have passed with such a sense of. I was kind of at this point at the end of this 3rd match, I was kind of feeling like I don't know if I can get to the end of the show, because if all the matches feel this way, have this same kind of tidy but unremarkable feel about them, then this is going to be a real slog. Luckily, that didn't happen at all. After we had a backstage segment where Eddie Edwards gave Tommy Dreamer a birthday present, again bringing up the fact that Tommy Dreamer was 50, which again, that being the reason for the title match is the reason they had to keep bringing it up. But part of me feels like if this really is going to be the guy who's in the main event of your pay-per-view, you don't want to keep going back to the fact that he's 50. But after that, we had the triple threat revolver match for the number 1 contendership to the X Division title. So for those who don't know, and there will be some people, because I didn't know what this match was before I started watching it, a triple threat revolver match involves 3 men in a match in the ring to start with, just like a triple threat match. But each time somebody is pinned, they are eliminated, and then they are replaced by somebody else until the number of competitors in the match have all come down to the ring. In this one, there were 8 competitors, so that was Daivari, Suicide, Willie Mack, Ace Austin, Trey Miguel, Chris Bay, Josh Alexander, and Blake Christian. And the winner would obviously be the number 1 contender to the X Division title. So I thought this was, in terms of a match idea, I thought it's something with a little bit of creativity, something with a bit of imagination. But what I was worried at first, the first 3 men in the ring were Trey Miguel, Blake Christian, and Suicide. What I was worried about here was that this was going to be back to the typical Impact Wrestling, even back to the TNA days of what you always get from the X Division. And at first, it did look like it was going to go that way. There were a couple of really convoluted 3-way spots that they tried to put together that just looked completely scripted. They looked planned. And you don't want that. That's when, for me, these kinds of matches fall apart. It's when there are too many obviously planned or scripted 3-way spots where they try to involve all 3 men doing something a little bit clever and convoluted. Thankfully, though, that only really lasted for the first elimination. So these 3 men were involved for a little while. There were some really good moves during it. There was a brilliant moment where Trey Miguel effectively ran towards a rope and then reversed his trajectory in the ropes and came back out with a Hurricane Rana, which I thought was really, really cool. Suicide was the first man to be eliminated. He was eliminated by submission by Trey Miguel. Once he went out of the ring, and there was a sense that the other two had already kind of been through quite a lot. When the fourth man came in, who was Chris Bay, the match changed and became, for me, a much more satisfying contest, which made a lot of sense. The suggestion was that Miguel and Blake Christian were at a disadvantage, and obviously they were, because they had been already out there, and so they used that to their kind of advantage during this match in terms of telling the story and building it all the way through. Which it meant that we had a lot more one-on-one action, and when there were kind of some three-way spots, they were able to be done in a slower way, which made them feel more organic. They didn't look quite so planned or scripted. Bay looked really good, I thought, during this match. At one point as well, Blake Christian did a standing Spanish fly, or at least that's what I'd call it, on the outside on Miguel. I think Matt Striker called it something else. Eventually, though, Chris Bay pinned Blake Christian with the Vertebreaker, which brought in entrant number 5, Daivari. Daivari, of course, has been around for a very long time now, over 20 years as a professional, formerly of WWE, of course, back in the early noughties. And during this point, Trey Miguel was out of action on the outside for a while, selling the cumulative damage that he'd taken during the rest of the match. And again, I thought that was well done. This made this match really good, is that we got away quickly from that kind of overly convoluted, overly planned, very fast-paced X-Division style, and went into something with a bit more imagination. There's still plenty of exciting, high-flying aerial maneuvers and really good wrestling during this one, but it wasn't in such a kind of rushed manner, which is often the way of these things. Eventually, though, Trey Miguel managed to get back into the ring and hit a Meteora on Daivari to eliminate him. Number 6 then came in Josh Alexander. And Josh Alexander, for me, he and Trey Miguel were the 2 stars of this match. Not only were they, for me, the best performers in the match, but also the way they were booked meant that they looked like the stars of the match, which was surely the point. Trey Miguel came in at number 1. So he lasted a long time, and Josh Alexander came in at number 6, would eventually go on to win the match. He managed to. There was a great exchange between Chris Bay and Josh Alexander, which ended when Bay tapped out to Alexander's ankle lock, which brought in number 7 Willie Mack. He didn't last particularly long. He was pinned by both of his opponents, both Miguel and Alexander, after another Meteora. Number 8 came in was Ace Austin. So this now meant that there were 3 men left in the match, and the one who took the next pinfall was going to be the victor of the match. There was a really cool double Death Valley driver by Alexander at one point. Then he also delivered a great looking powerbomb onto a knee and a pile driver on Ace Austin to take the victory. And for me, it was a really well booked, really well told match, this one. I thought it was just, I was really, really impressed, and it really got me back into this show. After the first 3 matches where I was a bit worried I wasn't going to last, this really got me back into it. And it got me back into it because it was something that I don't think I'd have seen from Impact Wrestling 5 years ago or more. I think in the past this would have been rushed. It would have been not particularly well thought out. There wouldn't have been the kind of thought that went into who got eliminated and when. There wouldn't have been an attempt to spotlight just 1 or 2 people. In the past, I think TNA and Impact Wrestling, in their various guises, would have tried to make all of these men do something that made them look cool, and therefore you'd have remembered none of them afterwards. I think instead what we got here was that Trey Miguel managed to last the entire match and didn't get pinned at the end of it, which I wouldn't be surprised if on television in the next few weeks they come back to. But in the meantime, Josh Alexander, who also looked one of perhaps the most impressive other than Trey Miguel, went on to win the match. So I thought it was a really good result, the right result, and they got 2 guys over and spotlighted those 2 guys in particular, which I thought was exactly what they would have been going for. So I was really quite impressed by this one. We then had another video package building up the Knockouts Tag Team Title Texas Tornado match between Fire and Flavor and Havoc and Nevaeh. I've not seen a lot of many of these women. I have seen Havoc before, but the other three are relatively new to me. I thought this was a little bit disjointed. It wasn't the cleanest of matches, but I think again that was a nice change of pace and a nice change of style to what we'd seen earlier in the show. The fact that it was a Texas Tornado rules match, for me, kind of, I struggle with that a little bit because Fire and Flavor are, if you've seen these two teams, Fire and Flavor are significantly smaller than their opponents, and so I just think it was not that believable that they were able to kind of stand toe to toe with Havoc and Nevaeh. I think it would have been easier to push that and to sell that angle of it had this been just a regular tag team match. In the end, though, it wasn't a bad match. It just was a little bit more. A little bit messier than a lot of the stuff that had come before. There were some good moments. At one point, Havoc double suplex both members of Fire and Flavor. And then Havoc missed a charge into the corner, which sent her flying into a chair, which had been set up into the corner at some point earlier in the match. This was, of course, a Texas Tornado match, which meant there was no disqualifications. And it resulted in the end in Tasha Steele hitting a cutter on Nevaeh for the pinfall. And afterwards, Nevaeh seemed to walk away from Havoc, suggesting that this will lead to something in the future. I like the little breadcrumb at the end. I'm a big fan of small bits of story or narrative that you can plug into later on if you want to, but you don't necessarily have to. So if they don't want to pursue a feud between Havoc and Nevaeh, they absolutely are not committed to doing so. But if they want to at some point in the future, this just leaves the breadcrumbs to allow them to do it. I thought, given that this was a Texas Tornado match though, and there were no rules, there was a little bit of a lack of weapons. Like, they brought a chair into it. At one point, they brought in a kendo stick as well. But given that you could do anything, I didn't feel like they really went as far as they possibly could have done. But it was okay. It wasn't too bad. We then had a backstage interview with Rich Swann where he hyped up his match with Tommy Dreamer in the main event. He talked about the fact that he had been the person who'd given Tommy Dreamer the title shot. And he also noted that Impact Management had threatened Moose with suspension if he got involved, which meant they didn't have to worry about Moose getting involved. Moose, I should mention, has been pursuing Rich Swann for a title shot as of late. There was then another video package hyping up the next match, which was for the X Division title between TJP and Rohit Raju. And again, this completely surprised me in terms of what it was. I was expecting this again to be going back to the old Impact Wrestling TNA style of X Division title match where it was fast, it was furious, there wasn't a lot of thought behind it, there were some big spots, and then one of the two men came out on top, and it didn't really matter who because you hadn't told any kind of a story or made us believe that we should care about which one of them won. It wasn't anything like that. It was actually a very, very, very good match with a really well-told story. Raju was accompanied by Mahabali Shera, which I'm surprised Shera is still around. He's been with the company for a very, very long time, and it doesn't appear like they're still using him in any kind of meaningful manner other than to be the corner man for Rohit Raju here. But yeah, I thought this was really quite excellent in places. Compared to the vast majority of the rest of the match, the pace was a little bit slower. It was a bit more methodical, but it was all the better for it. Just a really nice change of pace. There was some excellent wrestling, a lot more mat wrestling in this one than I've seen on anything else on the show. There were some really cool reversals, I thought, by Raju. At one point, he reversed an attempt, I believe, at a moonsault into a Northern Light suplex. There was a reversal of a suplex into a neck breaker. Just really, really nice stuff. And they kind of brought you into the journey they were going on in terms of the match. In the end, TJP won it with a springboard DDT and a Mambo Splash and overcame the odds, of course, with Mahabali Shera on the outside. But I was really impressed. I did not expect to like this and think it was. I think this was the match of the night, and I did not expect that at all. I really thought this was going to be a throwaway X Division title match. It does feel like, and I'm perhaps moving forward a little quicker than I should do here because there's still 3 matches on the show, but it does feel like that whoever's booking Impact Wrestling at the moment has got a really clear view of what they want to do, a really clear roadmap for where they want to go, is thinking with real clarity about how they're going to lay out these shows. Because, as I said, the first three matches I think could have been better slotted in across the rest of it, but actually the rest of the show from match 4 onwards, this was excellent almost right the way through. They weren't all brilliant matches. In fact, I would suggest that if you took them in isolation, that the Knockouts tag team title match and the six woman tag team match that's due up next are actually not as good as the 3 matches that started the show, but they are well placed in terms of accentuating the qualities of the matches around them. And I felt like at the end of this show, there were, I can sometimes I think in terms of the basics. So at the end of the show, if I was the booker, what would I want people to be taking away from their experience having watched it? And in terms of, for example, that X Division triple threat revolver match, I would want them to be taking away from it that Josh Alexander is an exciting prospect, and is going to be a real tough challenger for whoever the X Division champion is come the end of the show. And that also I need to be keeping an eye on Trey Miguel because he is a star waiting to happen. And they did achieve those 2 things. And I think that throughout the rest of the show, they did similar things with what else took place. The next match on the show, which I've already spoken about a little bit, is the 6-woman tag team match, which was Deonna Purrazzo, Kimberly, and Susan against ODB, Jazz, and Jordynne Grace. I thought this one was a little bit restricted by the fact that Jordynne Grace had to effectively carry her side of the deal on this one. She is clearly a very talented woman, but she was also in there with Jazz and ODB, 2 people who I think that A, have been around quite a long time and their best years are probably behind them, and B, I think ultimately just didn't quite have the... Jazz in particular, I felt, looked a little tentative during this one, as though she wasn't entirely comfortable being back in the ring, and her timing was a little bit off. It didn't feel quite like it was clicking for her. And ODB, I think, look, she's perfectly entertaining, but I don't think she really is in the same league as certainly that Jordynne Grace for me, and Kimberly also I thought was really good in this one. It was fine. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't brilliant. In the end, Jazz won the match for her team with an STF when Susan tapped out to her. There were a few convoluted spots, and I think the end was a bit anticlimactic as well. But look, I don't think they were looking for this match to be particularly important anyway to the overall show. Deonna Purrazzo is the Knockouts champion. She wasn't involved in the finish. They obviously were protecting her. But if they wanted her to be in a match that meant something, they would have had her defend the title, and I think this was just a gap filler, a way to calm everyone down after what was a very good X Division title match, and ahead of the 2 main events of the night. First of those 2 main events saw the Impact Tag Team Champions Good Brothers defend against both Private Party and Chris Sabin and James Storm in another triple threat match, this time in tag team form. Now the Good Brothers, I should mention, are Doc Gallows and Carl Anderson, who obviously have been in WWE and have been in New Japan and have been in AEW and are all over the place at the moment. They are currently the Impact Wrestling Tag Team Champions. Private Party are AEW talents, and this is part of the talent exchange that's going on between Impact and AEW, and New Japan and NWA, I believe, as well, are involved in that. And they are also managed by Matt Hardy. So they've got that kind of extra element. And then, of course, you've got Chris Sabin and James Storm, 2 long-time members of the Impact Wrestling roster who certainly don't mean anything in comparison to what they perhaps once meant, although the fact that they're still in Impact Wrestling suggests that the supposed meaning they had within the business was perhaps inflated by a time when Impact Wrestling were a bigger deal. The Private Party, the team Private Party, they were undoubtedly the people that carried this match. Mark Quinn and Isaiah Cassidy basically did all the work, when they did the majority of the work. They were in the ring for the vast majority of the time, and the other 4 men took it in turns to kind of have their exchanges with each of those. One thing that I did note during this match, and to be honest, it was something I had noticed throughout, was that Impact's entrance music is really poor. The vast majority of people are coming out to very dated sounding power pop or kind of electric guitar, rock, metal type songs that would have easily fit in a wrestling company 20 years ago. It feels like they really need to move with the times a little bit more. It was a real kind of a relief when someone like Fire and Flavor came out, because they at least had something different, whereas it just felt like everybody had the same very, very similarly dated guitar music to come out to. The ending was really clever during this one. I thought that they constructed a decent match. It wasn't as good, I don't think, as either the X Division or the Impact World Title match, but it was still a good match, and the ending was really cool. So they tapped into the fact that Private Party were the inexperienced of the three teams, which of course they were, and Matt Hardy, being their manager, was kind of part of that. And Matt Hardy had kind of helped them take the advantage. So the match was breaking down a little bit. Matt Hardy hit James Storm with a twist of fate. Then Isaiah Cassidy hit a really impressive looking shooting star press on Storm. But just before he'd done that, Carl Anderson had made the tag on Cassidy, and then threw Cassidy out of the ring at the minute he landed on Storm, and then covered Storm himself for the victory to retain the titles. And after the match, Matt Hardy berated his young charges and told them that they had let themselves down and let him down, perhaps more importantly. So then it was time for the main event, and before the main event we had another video package. So this was another thing that Impact, I think, employed really well throughout the show, was video packages to explain exactly why the people involved in the matches were involved. And this one showed Rich Swann's promo where he gave Tommy Dreamer the title shot for his 50th birthday, and showed also the sort of one thing I thought they'd done quite well, and it was done subtly on Impact Wrestling in the kind of last few weeks building up to the pay-per-view, was they kind of ever so slightly teased the idea that Swann and Dreamer were getting a little bit frustrated with one another. There was a good little promo where the two of them were due to face Chris Bay and Moose in a tag team match on Impact Wrestling, and Swann had said to Dreamer, look, I will take on the brunt of this match because I want you to be in peak condition for the match at No Surrender, which kind of Dreamer took a little bit of umbrage with, because he was sort of suggesting that Dreamer wouldn't be able to face the punishment of two matches so close together. There was also a bit in that match where Moose effectively went for a spear on Dreamer, and Dreamer managed to sidestep it, and he went into Swann instead and took the pinfall on Swann. So even though they hadn't kind of openly shown them angry with one another, they kind of wielded the idea that the two could be getting a little bit personally annoyed with one another through some of those moments. This was an interesting match, because I think, as I say, I wasn't expecting an awful lot from it. Tommy Dreamer, 50 years of age, never been a top-tier star for me, never been a top-tier wrestler for me. And now you're expecting him to come up with the goods in a main event against Rich Swann, who is a very talented guy, but I just didn't really know how they would do this. And early in the match, it looked like that Dreamer was occasionally laboured. He didn't seem to be able to quite keep up with Swann. His timing seemed to be ever so slightly off. But what they did, and I think this was clever and also strange in the same breath, and I'll talk about it now, is at one point, quite early in the match, after maybe 3 or 4 minutes, Dreamer had Rich Swann up outside the ring on his shoulders and delivered an awkward-looking Death Valley driver to him. Now, I don't know if the Death Valley driver was botched or whether or not it was supposed to look awkward, because afterwards, Dreamer then clutched his hand and poked his own finger out as if that finger had been dislocated. The announcers did their best to sort of build that up, to sell that kind of injury to Dreamer. And at first, I was quite convinced by it. I wasn't certain if it was real or not. And they had Brian Hebner, who was the referee for the match, throw up the double arms crossed in the air to say, this is a real injury, I need someone from the back to come out and help me out. And a doctor came down, he had a chat with Dreamer for a minute or two. Dreamer then rolled into the ring and supposedly clicked it back into place, and then the match continued. Now, it was very almost instantaneously exposed for being kind of part of the planned match when Swann then instantly went after that finger. Now, I don't there's a couple of things I've got to say here, and it's quite difficult for me to kind of unravel it and do it in a way that's articulate enough for people to understand. So, first of all, I don't really ever like them having someone throw up the arms crossed in the air. This is supposed to be a safe word, basically, a sign to say to the back, look, this is serious, this is not part of the storyline, I need someone to come out. If they didn't need that sign, if they didn't need that signal to the back, they wouldn't have it. If there was a suggestion that the people in the back would always know when the injury was legitimate because there hadn't been anything planned, then they would not need this sign. But if you're going to use it for fake purposes like this was, then you are risking the effectiveness of that sign in the future. Because let's be honest, not everyone backstage would know that this was planned or not. It's not like they would have gone, right, everybody, just so you know, at some point during this match, Brian Hebner is going to throw up the arms crossed. Make sure everybody knows, because it's actually fake during this match. It's not real. But on top of that, what would have happened if Swann or Dreamer had actually got hurt during this match and then they'd thrown up the arms? Now, again, it might be that in this instance there would have been no real problem because they'd have known what the difference was between the fake and the real occasion. But the point is why you shouldn't be in a position where, as something that is your safe word, that something that is your signal to the back that there's a problem, you shouldn't be using that. You shouldn't be even blurring the line slightly between that, if only for the safety of the two men in the ring, when at some point in the future, or even during that match, you need to use it in a legitimate sense. And if you're going to use it anyway, though, then there has to be a reason you're doing it, and that is clearly to make it look as though this is a legitimate injury, because insider fans know that that's what happens when the referee, when there's a legitimate injury, the referee will hold up their arms. Now, so what you're trying to say is, look, this is a real injury, and yet you've instantly then exposed it for not being real when Rich Swann has gone after it. So I just found it a little bit, I don't know, just a little bit, didn't really work for me. How it did work, though, is it slowed the match down, and it made the match more about that injury, and it made it more about submissions and about trying to hurt the other person as opposed to just kind of effectively having a decent looking world title match. And so it made it more believable, made it more interesting, and I thought that in the end they constructed a decent match out of this one. There was a couple of good close finishes towards the end, and in the end Swann hit a Phoenix Splash for the pin to take the victory in what I thought was a good match to end a good show overall, very good show. Before the cameras went off completely, we had Moose come out and attack both men. He speared them both, a couple of Uranagis to both. He worked over Swann's knee and ankle a bit with a chair, and then posed with both the world title and his version of the Impact Wrestling world title, which I had to look up after the show because I don't think that the commentators did a very good job of explaining what the other belt was. I thought the end, in a different circumstance, might have been a bit disappointing, because I felt like whoever the challenger was here, ordinarily you'd want to put over, even if they had lost, which they did, you'd want to put over the fact that they had given this a really good fight and next time they'd have a chance. And so by then having Moose come out and attack both men and effectively swatting Dreamer aside to focus on the champion would have made Dreamer look a bit of a jobber. The good thing was it was Tommy Dreamer, so they could do that. I think if it had been anybody else, I think I would have been a bit disappointed. But because Dreamer, you're not looking for him to be anything big in the future. You don't need to build him up. He is about as big as he'll ever be in terms of the significance to the people watching your product. So you don't need to worry about casting him aside for the time being. And having Moose go after Rich Swann. And again, this was another one of those things where I was like, look through the show, and if you're the booker, what are you trying to achieve with this? You're trying to achieve making Black Taurus look really cool in the opener. You're looking to achieve making Josh Alexander look like a real threat to Rich Swann's X Division title. You're looking to make Trey Miguel look really cool. You're looking to keep most of your champions in place, and they did keep all their champions in place and give them credibility boosting victories. So I think with Fire and Flavor, overcoming the bigger opponents that they had was a way to again get over the idea that these two are good tag teams that are going to be tough to beat as champions. You gave Rich Swann a victory, okay, over a 50-year-old Tommy Dreamer, which isn't exactly going to make him be seen as this, amazing top contender for the wrestler of the year this year. But ultimately it was another slight enhancement to his overall credibility as Impact World Champion, and at the same time, you're now going to set up for the next month or so until your next big show. So you're sort of putting in motion the beginning of Moose and Rich Swann's build up for their match whenever it comes. So as an overall show, for me, it achieved loads of different things. It was a good night of wrestling. It was very enjoyable. I was really happy to be able to watch it. I watched it on my phone on the Impact Plus app, which I wasn't expecting to be able to do. I thought it was going to be pay-per-view. And what I think is a really cool part of their offering on Impact Plus is that you can watch the shows for free, or you can watch this show anyway for free on your phone. And if you wanted to cast it to another device, though, that's when you had to pay for it. So I thought that was quite good in that you could watch the show for free, but you'd have to watch it on a small screen. If you wanted to sit there in your living room and watch on your telly, then you'd have to pay for it, which I thought was really cool. And so I would recommend this match show to people. I think it was a well-paced, well-planned show with lots of good wrestling, very little poor wrestling. I think there could have been, and in fact, I think the show weirdly could have been slightly enhanced by a little bit less good wrestling. Like if one of those first 3 matches was a bit shorter, perhaps maybe only was a squash of some kind or lasted 2 or 3 minutes. Yes, it would have annoyed some people because they wouldn't have seen the people in that match might be their favourite wrestlers and they wouldn't have got to see them have much of a match there. But it would have made the whole show for me just flow a little bit better in that early going. But as I say, after the 3rd match, once we got to match number 4, we got to the Triple Threat Revolver number 1 contender match. I thought this was a very accomplished show and I would recommend it to anyone. So that's the first episode of this. I don't know, as I say, I'm sure not many people will be tuning in. This is not meant to be something that will be watched or listened to by loads and loads of people. It's just a little kind of test, a little bit of a pilot, I guess, to see how it goes. And especially as it's Impact Wrestling, I'm sure the potential reach that it's got is a little bit limited. But I guess ultimately, look, this was an opportunity for me to talk about a show I'd watched. I'm going to probably do it again in the future. This was quite a busy wrestling weekend because we also had NXT TakeOver Vengeance Day, which I'm very possibly going to cover in a future episode in the next few days. Depends on the time I've got. And also, of course, we've got Elimination Chamber next weekend, so it might be another one that I take a look at. But either way, as I say, thanks for watching this entire video. And as I said, look out for future episodes here on YouTube of the RWR Solo show. So thanks very much, and I hope that we will see you again.